district covers the majority of Dunn County and a tiny bit of St. Clair County over there. So we really have, all different things from, of course, downtown Menomonie, right around us here, but also outlying areas, but the beautiful countryside, rural areas, Knapp, Downsville, Dunville, etc., are all included in this district. So you think about when you drive through all of Dunn County, the different types of homes and lifestyles that you see are all part of our public school. So I mentioned, we're going to get to the money issue, but I want to talk about values for just a moment. This is the mission statement of the school district in the Menomonie area. By embracing unique needs and using the strengths of our diverse community, we're dedicated to preparing all students to become lifelong learners, caring individuals, and responsible citizens. That word "all" is emphasized in the mission statement itself. I have not had that emphasis. The point is that the public schools are for all students, to give them what they need. Operations, called the operational budget, also known as Fund 10 in the lingo of how Wisconsin labels budgets for schools. And so the majority of this pie chart is the $40 million operating budget, which we'll dig into a little bit later. So these are the kind of things that the school district spends money on. Salaries and benefits of the teachers and paraeducators, administrators, and all the other staff in the buildings. Interfund transfers, this is things like we have special education expenses because there's students who need extra assistance. We are both obligated morally and ethically, and of course required by law, to serve the needs of every student. And the state only reimburses those expenses at now 35%. So 2/3 of every dollar spent for special education needs has to come out of the general fund, and so that's considered a fund transfer. There's prior debts from various operations, building projects, and so on, and then utilities, supplies and paper. Not surprisingly for a school, are pretty expensive, right? You've got lots of whiteboard markers going around. All right, so that is the short synopsis of our schools. What's in them? What's going on? Next. School funding in Wisconsin. This is the point where I might start to defer to Chris if I start to get a little mixed up, but I think I pulled a lot of good references here. So maybe 6 people in the room know this extremely well, and for everyone else, it's probably a complete mystery how schools are funded in Wisconsin. It comes from from taxes somehow, but how? So this is a chart from a Forward Analytics report that came out just about a month and a half ago. So school funding in Wisconsin, the first thing to know is it's controlled by state law. The way the district spends money and how it's spent and what can be spent on and where it comes from, all is written out very explicitly in state law. We have to follow exact flow charts of where things go, and it's audited every single year. Every other year? Every year, yeah. So this is statewide, this graph here. This is if you take all the districts across the state, where does their money come from? What's their revenue? So there's 2 huge categories: local property taxes and what's called state general aid. Those are the 2 things to keep your eye on. Those 2 items, which is the majority of spending on schools, are combined into something called the revenue limit. So every district has a number that it is not allowed to exceed for those 2 things combined. So this district raises money through property taxes, as you know, and of course it gets money from the state. The bulk of those 2 is combined into this revenue limit. There are a couple other items that end up in school revenue, which are always a little bit harder to track down. But there's a state per pupil aid. So the state, in addition to the general aid that goes to the school, just a big check once a year, has, looking at the total enrollment of the school, has another budget item which is sent called per pupil aid. And that can be quite confusing because often you'll see phrases like state aid, comma, per pupil, which might mean the total aid in the orange divided by the number of people, which is not the same as per pupil aid, so it's a very confusing term. There's state categorical aid, which is, I believe that's essentially funding for special education. So if you spend $1 to meet the needs of a student with an IEP, then the state pays now, it used to be 30 cents, now it's 35 cents of that dollar. The rest of that, by the way, has to be transferred from the general fund. And then there's, of course, some federal aid, and there's other local things that bar at the top, other local. That's things like usage fees, other community interactions with different organizations that might contribute to the budget. So it breaks down to a couple simple categories. The thing to keep your eye on those is these two at the bottom, which combine to be the revenue limits. There's state general aid and property taxes. All these numbers are defined in the state law every 2 years when the state budget is passed. So there's a state budget passed last spring. I believe it was passed in early June 2023, and 2021, 2019, and so on, 2017, 2015. So whenever these numbers change, it's because of a giant negotiation between the governor and the Wisconsin DPI, Department of Public Instruction, and the legislature. So there's a huge negotiation that goes on for about 6 months. In the end, they write down a budget and hopefully pass it, and all these numbers are set for districts across the state. So none of these revenues are really under our control. This is all set by state law. Now, the question before us is about what's called an operational referendum. So what does that mean? Well, a district can vote to exceed the revenue limit, so to break that fixed bracket there by a fixed amount. So you have to choose a number, and you get to basically expand that blue at the bottom by a bit, by whatever number you choose. And in the case that we're looking at, it's for recurring expenses, which means that that limit steps up and then stays level. So it's not going to keep increasing year upon year upon year. It's a choice to increase that number once and then keep that additional revenue in the budget. So again, the only thing that's controlled locally is being able to take this blue box and make it a little bit bigger. Everything else is completely fixed. And in order to do that, you have to vote as a community to pass what we call an operational referendum. So that's the situation that we're looking at. That's what it means. Okay, I see some people looking at this graph and kind of going like this. So for my math teacher days, let me pause and ask for questions. Yes?
So in year 5 on your chart,
Yep, it just keeps going.
It'll continue on as year 5. It's not just.
So yeah, indeed. So I only showed one of the pictures. So there's 2 types of operational referendum. It's called recurring, which is the situation that we're in, or non-recurring. So for instance, in Eau Claire, a few years ago, they passed a non-recurring referendum for 5 years, 4 years?
In 2016.
Yeah.
15.
Oh, 15 years, okay. So, thank you. So in Eau Claire, they passed a non-recurring referendum for 15 years, back in 2016. So their bar would go up for 15 years and then come down again. Recurring means it goes up and you're going to hold it there. So the recurring means that it does not revert. It should be called non-reverting instead of recurring. So we're agreeing to make this step up and stay at that level. Other questions on that point? Because this is a really important point about how the referendum actually works financially. So, yes?
Just a question, why is it necessary to keep it recurring? Because I thought the last time that we had a referendum here was 2015, and aren't we still paying that off? That was a one-time.
So, excellent question. So there was a referendum here about a decade ago. That was a capital referendum. So there's a different kind of referendum that we're not discussing today in detail, which is a capital referendum, which is you need to build or improve a building. And so the community says, yes, we need to build a new middle school or expand the high school. So it's a one-time project which needs a certain amount of cash injected to do that project, which is then paid off over time. So yes, about in 2015 there was a capital referendum in this district to pay for improvements to some of the buildings. However, as far as we could find out, this district never in its history has had an operating referendum. At least not. We looked back at records back to like the 70s, and there wasn't any history of one. So, yep.
Do you know, we hear many other school districts in the state that are having referendums. Are most of them operational and versus
Excellent.
structural? I'm not done. And then, what would that have looked like 10 years ago?
Excellent question. I have a slide on that. We'll get to it. All right, so that's what a referendum does, is it takes the state law, it's an exception in state law that says if you vote as a community, you can choose to increase this property tax portion to get more revenue. We, of course, cannot change the state aid, right? We can't tell the state to give us more, well, we can call them and can talk to our legislators, right? And I did that a lot in the last couple of years, trying to say, look, our schools need better revenue from the state. They can choose or not to do that as a legislator, and the legislation does what it does. But everything in that chart is fixed by state law. The only thing that we have control over locally is whether to take this property tax portion and agree to make it slightly larger to help fund the schools.
I didn't hear the answer to her question, why recurring versus non-recurring?
In this situation,
Yeah.
we'll get to that later.
Okay,
Yeah, because I've got a lot on all the graphs.
Yeah, I heard the question, I didn't hear that.
It's a great question, and yeah. So the other part of Sandy's question was about the kind of the capital referendum side, which is a different situation. Yeah. Okay, so now to Joe Cliff's question, school funding in Wisconsin. So as of a report from 2023. 82% of districts in the state have gone to operational referendum. Now, expectation is that by the end of this year, that'll be over 90%. If you look back just a couple of years, that number is only 62%. So in the last few years, districts across the state, now these are all operational, right? This isn't even, there are other capital referendums ongoing, but in terms of operational referendums, the one that pay for teachers and staff and ongoing expenses, a couple of years ago, about 62% of the districts in the state had gone to operational referendum. It has jumped, additional 20% have gone to in the last couple of years. And this year we think that essentially almost all the districts in the state within a year or two will have at least tried to go to operational referendum. So the blue in that, yep, yes, please do.
The difference with the Menomonie too, with the recurring, does that go with the non-recurring? They're gonna go back for a
Yeah, I'll mention the Eau Claire situation a little bit, and you can expand on that. So again, this section is not really about Menomonie, it's about the state, to understand the state funding of schools. So statewide, the blue districts, there's 450 something districts in the state. The blue ones, this chart again is from mid 2023, and there's even more blue on there now as we head toward February and April. So really quickly, the map is filling in of schools that have decided as communities that the state revenue is not sufficient to fund their needs. So all these things about referendums and how they work, this is not a Menomonie question, this is a statewide question about how the state budget works. When I get through this graph and we'll go back to that. So here is why. This graph is by the Wisconsin Association of School Business Officers, which is the professional organization of the people in every building in every school in the state who do the books. These are very smart, very boring accountants, right? They're great people. I love them dearly, but they're not politicians. They're not social activists necessarily. They are doing the books, and they look very carefully at these revenue numbers and how it all works every single day of their life. If you look back to, this graph starts in, you can't really see it, 2008, 2009 is where this graph starts, and we'll see other versions of this graph in the future. So this is an average, the gray line is an averaged rate of inflation since 2009 in terms of like what the additional value of a dollar, or the diminishing value of a dollar over time, if you will. And the blue line is, if you take the revenue limits, and divide them by the number of students in the school, so you get this idea of the revenue per pupil the state provides, again, accepting a few categories, but that big bulk in that chart, it has not kept up with inflation. So what this means is that if you look at that difference and ask, a lot of people here, maybe you have children who were in school in the 90s and 2000s, right? Maybe, so I graduated from school in 1999. Dominique, when did you graduate?
2010.
2010, okay, so Dominique is right there. All right, perfect, thank you. Thank you for being the example. There aren't that many examples of people younger than you, so. So Dominique graduated in 2010, okay? So if you look at what she got as a student in terms of funding from the state, funding approval from the state when she graduated, and move that forward with inflation. So you have to always look at things in today's dollars, right? That's how we have to think about finances. Dollars are always changing their value. You always have to reference today's dollars. So a student graduating today is getting $3,235 less, actually even less now because this is from a year ago, say $3,300 roughly less than Dominique got per student in every single class across the state. That's something on the order of roughly on the order of 20 to 30%. It's hard to say exactly because some of the computations change. But if you think of the revenue limit across the state is typically around $11,000 or $12,000 now. If it had kept up with inflation, it would be more like $15,000. So think about that. Think about it. Take a class of fifth graders, 25 fifth graders in the classroom, and what the school can do with those resources. And now for every one of those fifth graders, make sure that school has another $3,000 to help out in that class. That's what we're talking about here. That's the statewide effect that this has. Yes? Let me go back to Joe. Then I'll come up here. Yep.
Now, and I might need some help with this from the administration. If I recall that your chart at the very left,
Yep.
it actually goes back to about 1992.
Yeah, there's a longer version of this chart I'll take you later.
And then
Yep.
what happened in 92
Yep.
was that the state actually took a photograph.
Yep.
And from that photograph, all the school districts were frozen in place. And I don't know what the effect of all of that has been since 92. But I do know, listening back in 92, 93, 94, okay, the projection wasn't good. So
There are several points of history we can come back to. So let me come to this question in the front first. We'll come back to that question of inflation and historical legislation. Yeah.
When did school choice come in?
Good question.
Was
that
when
also-
you did
It was around, within a few years of that. I
Yeah.
don't remember the exact year.
The key reference years are like 1992, 1993 when the revenue limit was defined. I think it was defined in the 1994 school year. Is that right? 93. Then there was later in was it, I believe, 2003 when the revenue limit stopped tracking with inflation. That was the first year they said we're not going to track these with inflation. We're just going to keep them and do increments manually. And then there is, as many people in this room know very well, a huge upheaval politically in the state in 2009, 2010 with Act 10 and all the associated things, which is a whole other discussion. So, and that is when that drop-off happens that we see in this chart. So, short version is historical 30 years of elections in Wisconsin have consequences, and those financial consequences are seen in this chart. Sorry, go ahead.
So maybe you already covered this and I misunderstood, but the revenue limit, so you said the Department of Public Instruction, our governor and our legislators set that limit.
Yes.
So was their expectations of what it should cost, or that's just their expectation of what the government should take for taxes?
Unfortunately, I don't see either of my representatives here, but that's an excellent question. We have a former legislator here. I don't know if we have any. I don't believe we have any current legislators here. So yes.
We did ask for 2 senators and 2 representatives to come. I heard from Stachel he was too busy, and so was Clint Moses. So unfortunately, they were invited, but they haven't come.
Okay. Yes. Margaret.
Okay, I have historical information. When I was elected to the board in 1999, I got some prior year annual reports. And so if we look at the total revenue, starting at 94, 95, because I can't go back the previous year, and indexed to inflation, our students are actually receiving about $3,000 more.
I'd be curious to look at those numbers and carefully. That's not how it's worked out the way I've checked, but I wonder also if we're looking at the same revenue numbers necessarily. But yeah, let's follow up on
From the
that.
annual report. And I think one thing that's overlooked a lot is that when Act 10 went through, all school districts took a 5.5%
Yes.
cut in their base revenue.
That's the drop.
But then there became much more of the switch to more in the categorical aids and per pupil.
So
So revenue
yeah,
limits were less
there's some details there to key in on. One thing I want to point out is it is true that categorical aid and state per pupil aid have been clicked up a little bit year by year, but in terms of the overall spending, it's actually a very small percentage. So it's still true, even, those categories are, maybe didn't exist even in prior years, and gradually these two categories up here in the state aid. But it's still true that the vast majority of spending across schools is still included in the revenue limit categories, generally in property tax.
I have a guess in terms of how they're deciding how much to go up.
Sure.
Every odd number year, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau gives a history, and they keep track of state spending on education in terms of categorical aids and so. And it looks like overall they try to keep that up with inflation, sometimes a little more and sometimes a little less. One of the bigger concerns is the distribution of those dollars between schools.
Right, so there are a lot of, there's a lot of detail there to dig into. So let me get on with the general view, and then we can dig into those questions at the end of the Q&A, because I think there's some really important details there that are worth looking into. So what I want to do is take the numbers that we were just looking at and localize them to Menomonie now. So we're going from the general state picture down back to Menomonie. So this graph only goes back a handful of years. I acknowledge it does not go back to the 90s. This graph goes back to 2018. But this is the state revenue limit history. And a couple different things are shown here. So in in blue, well, blue and black, are the state revenue limit averages. So notice that this year it's estimated, it's around 12,600, 12,800 per student. So we talk about that gap of over $3,000 per student over time. That's the gap versus 12,000. So it's a pretty big percentage of that number. So this is the graph of how revenue limits have changed over the state. And Menomonie is the red with the dots. So we are well below the state average for all sorts of complicated historical reasons. Well below the state average in terms of what our revenue limit, how it's changed over time. Now, it has gone up in a strict sense, but of course the question is always up versus what, right? So not only are we, so in green, by the way, is where it would be had it been indexed to inflation going back those 2 decades. So we have, the green is somehow where Menomonie would have been, which is below the state average, but it is of course going to vary from place to place across the state. It's okay to be a bit below average in some cases, right? And if you can meet your needs. But we haven't even kept up with that. And notice also that over time, that gap is growing. So not only is that revenue limit low for Menomonie compared to districts across the state, the spending gap has been growing over time. Let me hold your question. I'm going to get to the next slide and we can come back to these questions.
I have a question on your slide.
Okay, let me go to the next one because I think it'll help answer it, and then we can. So this graph is very similar, but it's comparing us to nearby districts. So in the Big Rivers Conference, Menomonie, Chippewa Falls, Eau Claire, Hudson, New Richmond, Rice, Lake River Falls. So all the districts that kind of surround us and are of comparable size. This graph does go back to 2004. You can see that 5% drop from Act 10 right there, good chunk, right? And it's very interesting. I mean, this isn't meant to be a discussion of political history in the state, but how things were pretty tight up to that point. Everyone's kind of moving together, some higher, some lower. And then that happened, and there is this like scattershot of how it affected different districts. It's very wild from district to district across the state. So again, Menomonie is the red with the dots. There's 2 that are currently below us in terms of revenue limit, which would be New Richmond and River Falls. Something I want to point out on this graph is that if you notice that the Hudson and Rice Lake do these distinct jumps, that's when they passed operational referendum. Blue, dark blue is Eau Claire, 2016. That's Chris's operational referendum in 2016, which is going to expire in several years. Right. Now, Eau Claire is going up again. Chippewa Falls is going up for referendum this year. So is River Falls. I don't know what's up with New Richmond. I have no information on New Richmond. But New Richmond is, I looked at their finances on DPI, and it looks very complicated. So there's something going on in New Richmond I don't know about. Yeah. Yeah, actually, I've only been checking the conference, so I'm not sure about Boyceville, but if you know, yeah, okay, Boyceville and Cadott as well. Okay, so basically, in this, let me go back to this map. In this map, that whole, I don't know about the rest of the state, because I'm not as connected with them, but all these are basically filling in this year, this spring. Yep, okay, now let's go back to the questions about these charts. So I think, maybe I have a question here first, and then I'll go back to Joe.
Colleen had a question.
So
Yes.
you're comparing this chart to what other place? I can't read it.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the black and blue are the state average, either inflation adjusted or not. So this is Menomonie. So red versus blue is Menomonie versus the state average.
So the state average would include like Madison and
Yeah,
Milwaukee
all the
and
districts across the state, the
Hudson
450
and the real
districts across the
high-
state. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
However, it's actually interesting. The revenue limits for those districts, you know, Madison and Milwaukee, of course, have a lot of revenue because they have a lot of students. But the revenue per student actually isn't that exceptional in those districts either. So this is, in fact, the districts that tend to have a higher revenue limit tend to be the very large districts in, you know, up by Bayfield or whatever.
So that's
right?
what we're kind of comparing to those.
Right, and you can see why, because if you're a district that covers hundreds of square miles, or, you know, thousands of square miles in a remote area, where people are taking ATVs to school, you know, like.
So can we go to
Yeah.
the next one then?
Yes, so in our conference, this
Okay,
is.
so if the referendum passes,
Yep.
where would we be?
So I have a chart annotated with that in a little bit, but it's gonna bump us up on the order of, it's gonna bump us up
Like Hudson?
less than the average, but right around here-ish. It's a little hard on this chart because this is projections from last year, so it's not gonna meet the state average. It'll still be below the state average. To meet the state average, I think we computed the referendum would have to be about $6 million. We're asking for 4.2. So it's gonna get us closer to the state average, kind of in that ballpark, but not even at the state average level. It's still basically trying to meet the needs we have, but not go overboard. Okay, Joe had a question before.
Actually, it's more of it is a question. If you look at the school districts that are just to the west of Milwaukee, I noticed that they're not asking for operational referendums. Okay. Now, the school districts up in that north and east of us, they get some sort of aid because of the, as you mentioned, the expansiveness of the district. Okay, but it's those districts that are in just west of Milwaukee, the Waukesha County. You don't say it what it is. Okay. When the picture was taken in the 1990s, everything was frozen. And somehow or another, and that's where I kind of get lost a little bit. Somewhere in there, that picture, that photograph, that freezing is what's harming most of the state today versus Waukesha County.
So our regional representative from WEPEN can dig into that in great detail. There's a map of that discrepancy which was written in 2022 and updated this year, which I have in a different chart. Go ahead. Yeah.
My name is Margot Hecker. I am a regular here at Community Conversations. You have been asked to hold your questions until the end of Abe Smith's presentation. Please do so. That's respectful. Thank you.
All right. Well, a lot of these questions are also embedded in some of the slides, so we can we'll move into them and take some notes. So I do think though in some of the financial details, it's important to have some response when kind of the numbers are very complicated, all right, and kind of making sure that if we get too far ahead, it's going to be quite bewildering. All right, let's keep moving now. So this is a graph by me. The rest of the graphs are all by either district or other state agencies or other organizations. This graph I made, but what I did is I took the revenue limit numbers from the district, which I confirmed with DPI. So trust but verify, right? I took Joe Zalewski's numbers and I went to DPI and downloaded all of them and went through them and his numbers were right. And then I took the Wisconsin Consumer Price Index, Wisconsin CPI, which is what all state agencies use to track inflation. And I'm a mathematician, I did the inflation adjustment, all right? Let's look at what those numbers mean today. So if we take, going back to 2004, take Menomonie's revenue limit per pupil, per member, and adjust it into today's dollars. All right, so in 2023, in today's dollars, what would it be? If we move that number forward. So if you'd invested that dollar in a market with CPI, what would it be today? The present value of those dollars in technical language. This is the graph. So the revenue limit is just over $11,000 this year. If you go back to when Dominique graduated, that's that gap. Her revenue limit in today's dollars would have been about $13,500. So this is the, again, in today's dollars, inflation adjusted to say what would it look like today if the situation then were what it is today. This is the graph. And so when we talk about, often hear the phrase fiscal cliff. When the graphs are all going up, it's hard to see a cliff. But of course, whenever we talk about money, we have to think about money in terms of how it changes over time versus an investment or versus inflation. Anyone who runs a business or does any sort of personal finance knows this. This is that graph. In today's 2023 dollars, what those numbers look like. So that drop off here, it's an increase, a drop off, and an increase, and kind of some wiggles along the way. Well, those wiggles, those little kind of flattening outs, right? Those are actually dropping versus the value of a dollar. So this is the actual situation that we're talking about when we talk about what are we facing. It's because, yeah, it's the same number of dollars perhaps. Maybe even it went up as a number by $300, $200, whatever, but the value of that dollar is less by a greater amount. And so this is, to me, the key graph of what does it look like for a student today versus a student 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even 30 years ago. So I'd be curious, Margaret, to look at this going back to the 90s. The DPI currently only has their charts of CPI going back to 2004. So I'd be curious to dig up longer term numbers to see those changes. So that is the why now. The next question is why this amount? So how did we get to 4.2 million as a board, as a district? Well, like everything in life, it's a balance of benefits and costs, and thinking through what would different numbers look like and what would they mean. These are back of the envelope calculations, so if you actually put these into the actual spending spreadsheet, it'd be much more complicated. But in short, what's the benefit per student and what's the cost per property? Those are the two questions. This is a property tax question. So what is it going to cost property owners, many people in this room? And what is it going to benefit to the students in the classroom? So if you take that $4.2 million and divide by the number of students, it comes out a little over $1,200. And so that is that gap, which is going to move us up closer to, but not yet at, the state average. Kind of get us where we would have been had this previous graph not dropped so much. In some sense, well, I have a graph like this in a second, so go ahead. Cost per property. It's going to cost money. I mean, remember, just a comment, all public school funding comes from taxes. Of course, it's a government institution. The question is, if it comes from the state, is that state income tax? Or if it comes from the locality, is that local property tax? So we have a fundamental policy choice across the state. In any institution, how are you going to pay for things? Income tax versus property tax. Those are the two taxes. We also have, I guess, user fees, which are very small, and we have tariffs, but we can't tariff as a state. That's a federal thing. So those are your four options for how governments raise money, right? Tariffs, property taxes, or wealth taxes, you could say, income taxes, and fees. So at the state level by the state government, it was decided through these policy choices over 30 years to put the emphasis, to diminish the emphasis of the income tax portion. Right, to compel localities to look at property tax. So you have this choice as a state, are we going to pay for education with income tax or with property tax? Well, the legislature made that decision over 30 years. What we get to decide as a community is if we want to spend those dollars from property tax or not. It's a yes or no question. Now, how much would it be? Well, if you take the total property value of the district it comes out, the estimate, this is always an estimate because of course property values are always changing, et cetera, but the current best estimate that, that we can come up with based on all the data available is that for a $100,000 property value, it would be $82 per year. So about $650 a month. So I have a graph in here of my, hold on a second. These are I looked up my property taxes. So if you go to the Benton County portal, you can look up all your historical property taxes. And not my total property tax, my property tax just for SDMA. So I can show you later if you haven't done this before. You probably got the bill in the mail about a week ago, 2 months ago, or 2 weeks ago. But you can look in the historical data as well. So you might have seen, for example, oh, maybe there's an increase in county or city or something, or a decrease here or there. So I went to my property and looked back a decade in that data. And so this is not inflation adjusted. This is the actual dollar amount. It's actually been going consistently down over time. The blue line you can probably hardly see from the back is a trend line. The red dots are the actual value. So in 2011, I wasn't a property owner then, but the property owner at that time was paying $2,064 to fund SDMA per year from that property. And last year I paid $1,637. So there's been about a $450 drop, $350 drop in a decade in the actual dollar amount, not even inflation adjusted. Now, what would the referendum do for me with my property value? It would knock that up to this number. So that's the change for me personally. This is what's going to cost me. So this referendum is going to cost me personally. It's going to take my property tax next year, if it passes, from $1,637 to $1,832. So a little bit shy of $200 is what's going to cost me personally next year, out of roughly $2,000 to $1,600 total. So the thinking of this number is, is that the right balance? You could go higher, you could go lower, but there's going to be a balance somehow between the revenue per student that you're bringing in and what that can do in the classroom, and what it's going to cost every property owner. That's the choice we have to make as a community. So what would this money be used for if the referendum passes? Well, we're looking at declines versus inflation of all of our revenue. So what we're actually looking at is preserving and maintaining our programming. End of story, right? We're looking at keeping things running. If it were to fail, or if the district had not decided to ask for a referendum, then starting in the fall, this fall 2024, there would have to be dramatic cuts to operations. And by dramatic, I mean we'll come into this later. But so the thought was that this, looking at different options, different numbers, yeah, if you want to hit the state average, look at 6.1, 6.2 million referendum, or 6.0, somewhere in that range. Or you could say, oh, let's just try to squeak by with 2. Is that going to do what we need? Well, that's a balance between the property value, the property tax versus the benefit to students. And looking at what it would take to meet our needs and not going overboard, just trying to make sure we can maintain the programming that people seem to be happy with, this is the question that was put on the table. Okay, so what does this tax rate mean? Well, of course, people look at property taxes in a regional way. So this number is called the mill rate. That's $82 per 100,000. So, or if you divide by 1,000, it's 82 cents per $1,000 of property value. So the mill rate, the property tax rate for different districts in our region. This is a plot of them as of this year. So we're at $5.69 per $1,000 of property value. So if you have that's all I need to say. So a few districts are below the average, a few are above. We are definitely among the lower bars. And again, note, and I'll look at this list with Chris, which of these districts are currently looking at referenda this year. Chippewa Falls is, Eau Claire is, Hudson already did, River Falls is, you said Boyceville and Colfax?
I don't know.
Boyceville and, you said another one too. Cadott, okay, Cadott's not on the list. So a lot of these numbers are going to be bumping up by similar amounts across the board for similar reasons. So, people don't like paying tax, totally get it, right? That totally makes sense. But when we look at taxes regionally, the question is what's a reasonable increase that would not be exorbitant? So if we take that $5.69 and add 82 cents to it, So that would be at, hold on a second, I started talking and think at the same time, about 640-ish, 650? Which is still below that average of last year. It would get us up to some, somewhere up about there, right? So it's not like we're shooting to the stratosphere here. It's what appears to be, based on this data, a marginal increase. In terms of that revenue limit, inflation adjusted, we looked at before. So again, this is the revenue limit in today's dollars, and the graph going back 20 years. If you take that revenue per pupil, per student, which would come in from the referendum, this is the change that would make. So it would bring it back actually to where it was not so long ago. So again, it's not like, well, here's the picture I've got here. So this is a picture I thought of, right? So in some sense, like, there has already been a cliff, right? There's already been a drop off. The question is, can we, we've stretched over a year or two because there's federal pandemic money, which was able to be stretched out in various ways. In some sense, if, alternate universe, suppose the pandemic had never happened, we didn't have federal funding come in for it, et cetera, lots of things going on. But imagine the state budget remained the same as it is now. That graph would still be the same trend. It's hard to talk about inflation that way without the pandemic, but anyway. So, but in any case, that cliff has happened. We've managed to kind of bridge it for a year or two because of the way that funding has worked out at the federal level. But that bottom, that drop off becomes real, right? You look down and start kicking your legs this year, right? And so the question is, do we want to build a support there for ourselves, or let it fall as it basically already has? That was a bad metaphor. I apologize, but that's the most I could come up with for that picture. So it's that, and then if we look at the tax rate in terms of that mill rate, so here's the mill rate, the property tax rate year by year for the district. It's been going down for years. Now, this is for complicated reasons, because if the district is able to raise a certain number in taxes by state law, and if your property value goes up, then the tax rate has to go down to meet the same constant, right? If you have more value in your property and you get the same number out in terms of dollars, the rate has to decrease. So it's a little hard to read these graphs, but basically what the operating referendum would do is do a one-time step up in this graph and then maintain that step. And that's the recurring part, is it's maintained into the future. So that's the tax impact of this, which, again, property valuations are always changing. It's very complicated to talk about like wealth taxes versus income taxes. It's a very intricate tax policy question. But in terms of like, is it a reasonable change to the rate? The board, when this was approved to go on the ballot, thought that this was a fairly modest change to the tax rate in a way that would be, obviously it's money out of people's pockets, right? But it didn't appear to be catastrophic compared to historical trends. Again, that was my taxes. That was the inflation adjusted. Okay, so I think, so what are the consequences? I'll kind of wrap up in this section, and then we can do all the Q&A that you all have bottled up. So consequences, yes or no? So first of all, Joe Zadowski had slides on what happens, and I'm gonna literally take his slides and then comment on what they mean. Because I know sometimes, when it comes from the administrator has to be very careful on how things are phrased, because what he says is more or less policy, right? In this kind of conversation environment, I think people really have questions like, what does this actually mean? So this is Dr. Zadowski's slide. What is a recurring operating referendum? So approval of the referendum was allow for a one-time increase in the estimated revenue limit that would begin in 2024 and continue into the future. That's what it means. We've established that today. Revenue from the referendum could be used for district operational expenses, Fund 10, such as programming, staffing, transportation, equipment, supplies, etc. So what does that actually mean? Programming, staffing, transportation, equipment, supplies, etc. Well, if we look back at this pie chart we saw before, again, this is the total $65 million budget, of which $40 million is the operational expenses. Salaries and benefits, paying for transfers to pay for special education expenses, things like transportation, busing to get students to and from school and events. That's essentially what we're talking about here, right? It's not about, these other categories up at the top, it's not about those. It's about salaries, benefits for the teachers and staff. It's about paying for the needs of our students in the classroom, and it's about getting students to and from school. That's what these phrases mean. So if we dig into that fun 10 question, this is the chart from the annual report from this summer of just the operational expenses. This is how they break down. Salaries and benefits are 76%-ish of the $40 million operating budget. There's various services we need, transportation costs, equipment, supplies, books, etc. Right? So what we're looking at here is a picture of people and the things you need to run a classroom. That's what we're actually looking at here, right? To get students to and from school, to have people in front of them who are professional educators, and make sure they have the equipment that they need. That's what operational expenses actually means. So what's the consequence? So hold on a second. So this is again Dr. Zadowski's slide. Without a referendum, deep budget cuts may result in higher class sizes, less academic support, fewer qualified teachers, reduced transportation, longer bus rides, fewer stops, less supervision, school closures, less summer school, outdated technology, higher student fees, deferred maintenance, fewer extracurricular activities. That's a very broad sounding list. But let me dig into why these are the things that are mentioned there. So the Wisconsin Association of School Board Officers had this slide from a recent presentation about how are districts across the state handling this budget crunch, this budget crisis. Well, across the state, districts are doing temporary stopgaps like deferring maintenance to buildings and technology, delaying positions to be filled, so if someone retires, maybe not filling that position, or they call it other unsustainable gymnastics, by which we mean trying to make a one-time cut for an ongoing problem. Increased use of the fund balance, which we'll talk about in a moment, if people want to talk about that. Having a referendum to exceed levy limits. And then last resorts, staff and program cuts, larger class sizes, and delay compensation. So if the referendum were to fail, we are in the last resort category in that list. Right? So this slide, I want to be very careful. This is not a statement of policy or of any plans, but a general commentary on how the economy works. Okay, so public schools must both morally and legally serve every student in the district. End of story. Right? That is the job of a public school. Serve every student in the district. So there is a fund balance, which is essentially a checking account that can be used. It is used to pay things like monthly salary, monthly bills and things like that, because the district only gets its revenue, say, once or twice per year from the state budget. So there is a fund balance, just like you have a checking account. You spend, right? You put money in the checking account when your paycheck comes in, and then throughout the month you spend it down. And then it gets replenished and you spend it down. It gets replenished and you spend it down month after month after month after month. That's what the fund balance is for the school. It was built up to a certain level where we say this is the amount of dollars we need to pay our bills with a little bit of extra buffer. And every year it's basically burned down and then replenished. And burned down and replenished. Because that's how accounts work. If you look at that pie chart of the different categories, no single category can meet this need alone. For example, that transportation slice in that pie chart is about $3 million this year. So if we have a roughly $4 million deficit, or this gap of $4.2 million, that is more than all the busing for all the students and all the activities and every morning and every evening in all the schools, etc. Right? That's not enough to cover it. You can't just reduce busing, a little bit, one fewer routes. No, we're talking about like massive impact if that were the category that would be hit. What about building maintenance? Well, we've got a 30-year plan for building maintenance. So you're saying, okay, let's start deferring maintenance. So the amount that goes into the building maintenance plan is, I believe, is what, $800,000 a year? Is that transfer roughly? So less than $1 million a year goes into that account for doing building maintenance. So you start deferring that. Okay, so we're asking for $4.2 million, and you're going to defer. You're getting $800,000 of that out of the entire building maintenance budget. What happens in 3 or 4 or 5 years when that boiler fails, that roof starts leaking, that HVAC system starts spraying Freon into a classroom, right? The floors are, you need secure entrances on your buildings, the lights start filling in the gym. Things fail in any operational system, and the district has a 30-year plan to maintain those things, which is funded at a steady state. So the big category in all these charts is staff. School is made of people, not of bricks and not of school buses. So if you have to make cuts to staffing, there's, we all know this for any business, any organization, there's basically 2 ways to do that, right? Or any combination of them. You can, start reducing salary and benefits so they become uncompetitive in the market, or you can start cutting positions. So those end up the same place for a school, because right now there's a teacher shortage. It's very hard to hire teachers nowadays. If you put out an advertisement for a teaching position, you might get a handful of responses across the state, whereas it used to be hundreds for open positions. So when every district around us, may have better, more guaranteed revenue, staff will start to say, hey, I live in Elkmount. I'll drive east to Chippewa Falls or Eau Claire instead of driving west to Menomonie each morning. It's fine, no problem, right? I'll transfer there, get an extra couple $1,000s, and same career, same experiences, right? But then Menomonie is down that teacher. You'll have senior teachers who will start to, maybe either retire early or will lose those years of talent. We had some retirements recently that added up to like over 70 years of experience in 3 people retiring last month, right? So you think about when teachers leave the classroom who are experienced, the amount of just deep knowledge and care for students is just vanishes from our perspective. So you're in a situation where staff will certainly, compared to the market around them, have less competitive salary and benefits and fewer staff available to meet the needs of students. So we know what this means. We've probably all been in a job like this before, right? You'll have higher burnout, higher fatigue, people less willing to do the extra thing that is special for that student. So, we talk about activities, things like academic decathlon or science Olympiad. Well, sorry. They're paid a token amount essentially, right? But they're largely volunteer activities. So if you have fewer teachers with more stressful classrooms who feel kind of under the gun professionally, and they're more fatigued, are they going to want to spend their Saturday driving 6 students across the state to an event, right? Are they going to want to spend, be at the school till 8:30 p.m. coaching something, and just say, maybe I just don't have enough energy for this right now. So you're going to see that gradual erosion of all these programs over time as salary and benefits get impacted. So again, these are not statements of policy or plans. It's just like, how does the economy work, right? Just like, how are our teachers compensated? And I promise I'm nearly done. I know people have lots of stuff they want to talk about.
This is a community conversation.
I know. So here's last year's comparables of Menomonie's teachers' average salary in years of experience of Menomonie versus neighboring districts. We're not, we're right in there. You can ask what for a first-year teacher versus a 10th-year teacher. There's variation, of course, in different pay scales, but our teachers are paid competitively, but not exorbitantly. And I know you cannot read this chart, but all the hourly staff, paraeducators, assistants, custodians, and so on, these numbers, I probably can't read them from back there, but they're largely in the high teens to low 20s per hour. So people doing these important roles, like being a paraeducator helping students with special needs, they might have an option of a better wage at Culver's than in a classroom. Less stress. So this is my last slide. That's part of this. This is why we're here. This is what the question means. Let me read it one more time. This will be on your February 20th ballot, and there's lots of things to consider. But the question is: shall the school district of the Menomonie area be authorized to exceed the revenue limit by $4.2 million beginning in 2024-2025 for recurring expenses, for recurring purposes consisting of operational expenses. So hopefully now all those words make sense in terms of what the school is, what our revenue limit is, why this amount, why now, and what it would be used for. All right, that was a lot of talking, I apologize. But let's take a break for a minute and then we'll who's the MC here?
So I'm wondering if people would line up over here, if you have questions, can you hear me from this microphone?
Yes.
What's your name?
My name is Lorraine Vetter. Lorraine Vetter.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
I think this mic is actually maybe working a little better, so you could have people come up over here if you want. So I think that one's a little quieter.
Either side,
So-
but if you're using this one, I'll just turn it up a little.
We can just hand it back and forth. So.
Yeah.
And again, in the interest of a community conversation too, again, there's people who know the numbers better than I do in this room. In particular, Brian Seguin, our assistant superintendent in the district. So for anything involving curriculum, education, lots of budget stuff, Brian is literally the person in charge of that. So. All right, there were lots of queued up questions from before. I lost track of who had what, but maybe if people want to grab a mic or.
I'm not shy.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nicole Manson, and Lana mentioned it, school choice. I think that's kind of choked out our available public school money. I looked up the history of school choices from the late 80s, so it's been 40 years of school choice, but recently, wasn't it, school choice was given a higher percentage increase than actual schools? Sorry. My husband and I chose where we have our son in a different school right now, not going to public school. He's going to virtual, but it's still public, I guess. But after COVID, we decided to stick with that because he was thriving with that environment. So as homeowners, we're not exactly thrilled about an increase in our taxes, but we want our kids to be educated. So it is what it is. But I just wanted to bring up the fact of school choice. Is there anyone that's got input on the other side of it that thinks that school choice is a good idea?
So I have a slide somewhere on that. Oh, here we go. Okay, so just for context, so there's multiple layers here. On the one hand, there's school choice and open enrollment across different public school systems, including online public school systems. There's also the private school voucher program, which is sort of bolted onto that sideways. So I want to, maybe Brian, if you want to disambiguate those two, are you willing to do that? To school choice and versus vouchers and how they affect the district?
Okay. Think my
Maybe not in front of the speaker.
All right, so school choice is that parents can choose to have their child attend a school other than their resident district. They can open enroll them. They can attend a neighboring district's school. Voucher program. In a nutshell, there is a dollar amount associated with a student that if they go to an identified qualifying private school, the parents can receive those dollars to help offset that cost. There is an impact on an annual basis. It does lag slightly how that calculation is done without going into lots and lots of very technical terms. In a nutshell, that's the difference between those two. In Menomonie, we currently have 2 private school voucher schools in our district boundaries. Next school year, we will have a 3rd.
I have a question for you.
So, just for context, Craig can stay up here. I'm sure he'll have lots of questions that I'll give to him. The private school voucher program costs are, goes on the budget as this year be about $722,000 in that voucher program. So again, that alone is also not enough to, the gap we're looking at. It's like many things, it's a contributing factor, but not the only contributing factor. One thing that is interesting from a policy perspective, is that this year, again, our revenue limit this year is $11,325. The number going to a high school student in the voucher program is $12,387. So the private school is actually getting more dollars from the district than the district is from the state in the first place.
How many students?
How many students? I don't have that data here.
You could just divide the 12,387 into the 7.
There's other categories for 4K and stuff, but it's, I want to say it's like,
I have Menominee's.
oh, you do? Okay.
The old numbers.
I actually have that presentation in
Why
here.
is there enough for that? Why isn't it the same?
You would have to ask the Speaker of the Assembly that question. The Speaker of the Wisconsin Assembly that question.
So when you-
that was the negotiation that, Ruffin
When
brought
you
up.
put the expense, taking the money out to pay the private schools, where is that?
That goes straight onto the tax levy. So that 722 basically will appear on the tax levy. It won't be itemized, but
But you know your circular
Yeah.
chart and everything, where is it in those percentages?
That's an interesting question. That's a very good question. I'm not quite sure I know the answer, so. Okay.
Can you give it to me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll
Yeah.
give mine
Yeah.
then.
Okay, sorry, you had a
I
follow.
wanted to follow up.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I wanted to follow up because it sounds like the voucher program takes money away from the school district? It's not just coming from the state, it's actually coming out of the, okay, so my son being enrolled in a virtual school, does that take money from
That's not which virtual school,
WEVA?
Wisconsin,
Yeah.
within the district.
Statewide one?
So Wisconsin Virtual Academy, the school district partners, so that is viewed as, that's our virtual school.
Okay, so it's a wash.
It's a one.
Sweet.
Yes. So you're
All right, so, I see it. Joe had a question. Can I just get a quick show of hands about, we have, okay, let's do a queue so we can kind of keep things a little organized.
I have heard from neighbors, I guess, that this includes an 8% increase for teachers in their salary. And so I need to know if there's any truth to that or what.
All staff.
And 12% in healthcare
Well,
benefits.
hold on, let me answer that question in detail. So, okay, so for a long time, the way the district adjusts salary and benefits, salary and wages each year, right, is like most districts across the state, is we look at the Wisconsin CPI. So last year, in 2022, 2023, in the post-pandemic year when things, prices skyrocketed, et cetera, statewide, the consumer CPI was, I believe, 8.1%, 8%. So the district, in years when the CPI was 1%, was indexing those salary numbers to CPI. So when the CPI was 8%, we indexed it to that number. So that's the index by which when there's adjustments to salary year by year. Now, I think the term raise is very tricky here because for two reasons. First of all, from the perspective of the employee, all we're doing is keeping them afloat, right? Because we're saying that there's a cost of living adjustment to the number, but versus the CPI across the state, that's basically keeping them level. And secondly, there's actually kind of a trick that happens. So when teachers are, mature through their program and get more experience, they move to higher pay brackets, of course. These are called steps. With the exception of 1 year, which was 2.5 years ago, the cost of living adjustment tied to the consumer price index, which was 8%, is computed including whatever steps that they hit. So if a teacher got a promotion, and then we look at what their salary should be after that promotion, that's essentially was largely taken out of the 8%, right? So what we're doing is we look at what will it take to keep the teachers afloat within our pay scale, and so that number was 8% last year. It will not be that this year. This year CPI is tracking more like 4.5%, maybe 5%, but it's going down quite quickly. And yeah, so when we talk about like these expenses versus inflation, oops, where's my graph when we talk about revenue limit and adjustment for inflation, right? So that's why the adjustment for inflation is there, because we have to make sure that our employees are themselves staying afloat. Otherwise, we're building decreasing salary into their system. So I don't think it's fair to say there was an 8% raise. I think there was a cost of living adjustment to keep them afloat, which tracks CPI, which was 8%. In terms of the healthcare change, last year, healthcare costs went up enormously. So if the district had kept the healthcare plans as they had previously been, we would have been looking at, I believe, a 21% increase to total healthcare costs across the district. Now, the district is self-funded for health insurance, but we still have to, work with an actuary and get a plan, right? So a 21% increase in 1 year to the healthcare costs across the district. By rearranging plans, and from the employee's perspective, making them much less attractive, I must be honest, right? By making the plans, by moving to the employees in the room are like, they're really, there's a lot of, let's just say, anger about the healthcare change. But because of changing the plans to make them less expensive for the district and hopefully less expensive for the employee, we managed to keep that increase to something like 10 to 11%, right? So that jump of the healthcare costs, which would have been 21% had we kept everything the same in terms of the plan, we managed to cut that in half. So.
Isn't healthcare and insurance part of the CPI also?
It should be.
Yes, it is.
So anyway, yeah, that's the I think the clear answer I can give to that salary question.
Yes.
Next.
I don't have a question per se, but I had an observation on some of your slides. And I just want to make a comment. Personally, I think education is probably the top need in our society. I don't think of anything any better. So I'm for education. I'm going to vote for the referendum. And one of the things I wanted to mention when I was looking at those slides, I think it was Dr. Zadowski's, what do we lose if this isn't passed? And you had a whole list. Higher class sizes, less academic support, less qualified teachers, etc., fewer extracurriculars, all of those things. I look at those as an erosion of society. I look at all of those things as placing stresses on the teachers, stresses on the students, the children as human beings, not as just as the person, stresses on the parents, and all of that then puts a burden on society. And the question that goes into my mind is, what might that do to crime? What might that do to stress our society? The consequences that we're going to pay that we don't see on this school budget, but they're seen in other elements of life. People don't think about that.
Margaret?
Well, I have a couple of comments here on that.
Go ahead, I'm just gonna take
Okay, well, the slide looked like our revenue per student was less than the vouchers, but that was revenue limits only. Based on our mid-year hearing that was budget hearing in January, our total revenue per student is $17,000, a little over $17,000. So it's really important to look at total revenue when you're making comparisons rather than just the revenue limits. I'm not convinced that any of these reductions would be necessary without the referendum. This fund balance checking account type thing that was mentioned, it's up to 17 million. We have about 7 million more than is necessary for cash flow. Now, in February 2023, the Baird Financial Institution did a forecast that showed inflation would be going down and that revenues would start outpacing inflation. Revenues would start outpacing expenses again by 2027-28. Now things have changed. We got $49 less per student than the governor had recommended. But our end of year finances have been better than predicted. And so now it only looks like about $6,000 over the next few years, a deficit that could easily be covered with the this $17 million fund balance. The reason I looked in this so much is I saw that our fund balance, our checking, has been going up about $1 million, more than $1 million a year since 2009-10. And if we go back and look at things prior to the pandemic, I noticed that we added 45 teachers and 25 paraeducators that I could really see are needed during this pandemic. But even if we kept them all, I don't see why we need 4.2 million. I can see 4.2 million if we want to add lots of programs and things. And if I knew what these ads would be, but telling us without even a preliminary budget for 2024, that suddenly we're going bankrupt with a $17 million fund balance, it just doesn't seem right.
Thank you, Margaret. So the fund balance was mentioned previously, so I wanted to explain that a little bit more. So here's the graph from the mid-year budget hearing that Margaret alluded to from last week. So the fund balance, what this is for, is, so this is basically the kind of cash on hand the district has for operating expenses. The red versus blue in this graph doesn't matter. That was from a different discussion about what they're assigned for. But just look at the top, at the overall bar shape. So it's true that had been growing for many years, and for about a decade, previously the district did not have a fund balance at all. And so what happens in that situation is that you have to, it's February, you have to pay teachers' salaries. Where does that money come from? You don't have cash on hand. Well, you go to a bank and get a short-term loan for 6 months, and you're paying interest rates. It's basically a payday loan from a consumer point of view, right? You're basically using payday loans to pay your bills. And so to maintain financial stability, the responsible thing to do is to have a fund balance which can cover your expenses across the course of the year. So this fund balance has grown over time, and so now I don't remember the exact number from Leah, but I think basically that, as Margaret was indicating, something like, I think it was on the order of 10 to 12 million of this is basically spent down each year through those to pay ongoing bills, and there's several million left in there at the end of the year when that's spent down, and then it's replenished when the revenue comes in from the state. So just for context, the school board definitely did discuss how to use the fund balance and if it would be used as some sort of bridge. One of the things that was discussed was, how many years could we go using the fund balance and spending it down so that it just, kind of breaks even. And the thought was that it would basically be maybe a couple of years, a year and a half to 2.5 years, depending on circumstances. And the question was, well, then what? So the fund balance, it's definitely true the district is not bankrupt in the sense we do have cash on hand. But the budget is about flow in and out, and so that maintaining that balance is important. Maybe it certainly is not going to grow. It's certainly not going to keep growing. It'll definitely start to diminish pretty soon. But it's not. The goal is not to have it go down to zero. So yeah, maybe you could spend it down for a year or so before things start to get really shaky.
Hi, my name is Emily Weiss. I had the superintendent of schools, Joe Zakowski, on my podcast. And one of the questions I asked him was, I've read that you hired several staff members going into the COVID pandemic. I also asked him, have you let every one of them go now? You don't have any more of the additional staff. He said, they are all gone. I don't understand. I just sold my business in May, okay? As a business owner for 35 years, I just don't understand the logic behind all of this. I feel that the school district should be run as a business. And my understanding is everyone got an 8% increase. You find me an employer that gave anybody an 8% increase in the last 2-3 years. Plus, my understanding is teachers got an increase already, in addition to the 8%. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't have the history of that a lot of people have about the school district. And the insurance. So public information, I don't know what the total increase is, but I'd like to for the, I'd like to know what the total 8% increase is, and then what additional payroll taxes or whatever accommodate that. What are we talking? I know that, I believe that our superintendent went from $187,000 a year to $203,000 a year. That's a big increase. That's more than some people make a year.
One of the highest paid in the state.
Mm-hmm. And we have a relatively small school district. I think that where would, I also know that you got a $6 million COVID money. Where did that go? I don't know. All I can say is I don't know how the school district operates. But I think that they need to be more financially responsible to the taxpayers. I have a really good friend, retired, widow. She told me before, when she first heard about this referendum, she has a savings account or investment account. Her advisor, her financial advisor told her, you've got 4 more years of this money before you run out. Every year she has to take money out of this fund to pay her real estate taxes. Now you're asking this woman to take another $164 a year out of her account. Shame on you. Yes, education is important. I think it's one of the most important things. Is it really necessary for us to be paying our administrators these astronomical amounts of money when we should be putting it into our children and teachers? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a couple of details there I want to illustrate for people who haven't looked into the numbers. So one issue that was mentioned was the administrator salary. I did actually look that up last night when I was looking up data to double check. So this is administrative salary per position across the state for all the superintendents across the state. So if you look at all the different districts across the state, this was the distribution. I guess this is 2023 is this data. And just for reference, Dr. Zalowski is right about here. So he is on the above average, but it's not. I don't think it's fair to say it's among the highest in the state. It's kind of within a standard deviation of the mean across the state. So I also did the same graph. I didn't plot it here for salary plus benefits because there's always a concern about if the things like retirement benefits are equally distributed. It's basically the same plot across the state. I do agree that, for my own sake as a school board member, that we have to look at administrative pay very carefully to see if we're getting value for that dollar, because it is, it is a significant expense. I think it is worth noting that, that the individual who's in that position aside, and what people think of that person's job performance or other considerations. That's of course a whole different discussion for the school board to have. But this is a person who directly oversees 450 employees, and is on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, essentially the entire year. So it is an expensive salary compared to a first-year teacher. That's absolutely correct. It's also a salary which is in line with what we see across the state and in similar executive roles.
Are you also looking at the comparison of the size of the school district to
Yes.
that salary? That's what we need to look at.
Yes.
That is astronomical when you're talking about a 3,290.
Which has declined.
So I have that data actually in my laptop, which won't connect to the computer until the screen right now. And we can dig into that later. So I did look at that data. It did not seem significantly, and it was not an outlier.
You're forgetting, that 207 is a salary, or 203,000 is salary. He also gets huge benefits. And let's take a look at the total package.
So again, I did indeed crunch those numbers last night. I'm happy to share them and go over them. So for the salary, here's the graph. So this is, that question has come up in many contexts, and speaking just for myself as a school board member, the school board, in some sense, the school board's one and only job is to oversee the district administrator. Like that's in some, it's not involved in students' classrooms or things like the student classrooms or teacher classrooms and things like that. The board exists to make sure the administrator is doing their job. And definitely as a board member, I hear these concerns and note them and keep them in mind as we look at the evaluation of the administrator every year. Let's go on to Lorraine.
I have a lady that is one of my church members that asked me this question. She's also has a limited amount of money, and she's concerned about increases of her taxes. But she wonders why, with this surplus that we have at the state level, why our representatives, are not granting our schools more money from that large surplus that we still have. Talking about surpluses.
Okay. And actually, this ties back to a question that comment that Margaret Reich had about the state projection from Baird that we did last year. So the internal machinations of the state budget are very complicated. And for those of you who follow state politics carefully, you know that from about almost exactly a year ago, there was a huge negotiation going and stopping between the governor's office and the Assembly Leader Robin Voss about what they were and were going to compromise on. So the voucher system was under a lot of discussion. The state tax surplus was under a lot of discussion. And the governor's DPI proposal for school budgets that Margaret alluded to in terms of the projections. So Margaret mentioned that there's a projection where by 2027, 2028, everything will be evened out and pretty much okay, and actually have a slight budget surplus projected. Those projections were based on the governor's proposed budget, which was not accepted by the legislature. The legislature did approve some increases to education budgets in terms of a couple aid categories and an increase across the board to the revenue limits. So that was very helpful. And I think if those changes had not happened, the gap that we've been discussing today would be more like that $6.5 million number, maybe $6 million number, versus the 4.2 we're looking at. So that was certainly helpful. But yeah, in the governor's proposal at the state level, his proposal is basically to spend down that budget surplus at the state level, primarily into education and a couple other categories. So that was not accepted by the legislature, and I think as people in this room very interested in civics and politics, it's worth watching that carefully as the next cycle of budget discussion starts in about a year. So.
I'm Margot Hecker. Again, this is Community Conversations, and I want to make a community positive suggestion. I tried to volunteer with children at Menomonie School District. I left a message on a principal's voicemail, never got back to me. Okay, I suggest that the school district hire a full-time, not a teacher,
a full-time volunteer coordinator, so that we can volunteer in that, because I would pass a background check, I was a licensed therapist, yada, yada, yada. So that's my suggestion. The other suggestion is for Nicole or anybody else who wants to keep their child in the public school system, and not do the school voucher thing. I had a daughter who wouldn't have benefited from attending such a large high school as Menomonie High School. I ended up doing open enrollment with her at Elk Mound, which meant that I drove for the first 3 years and she drove for the 4th year. It worked out. She lives in Chippewa County. She works in Chippewa County. Yeah. Okay. She married a boy from Elk Mound. Okay. There you go.
I just have a couple of questions. Okay, so I get that, we're bumping up basically our revenue limit. Does that necessarily mean that that's what you have to spend every year? Or that that's what you have to? Because, getting back like we were talking about the revenue limits and how everything was frozen, there are a number of schools that their per pupil revenue limit is like $20,000 or more. Obviously, those schools don't need referendums. And I'm sure they're probably not spending that. It's just that's how far they can go. So will you always spend that? Or could it be less?
That's an excellent question. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So what the referendum does is it gives authorization to levy up to that amount. So there's no obligation to levy that amount. So, obviously, the budget, as we've discussed, is under a lot of pressure from lots of different angles. So it's hard to, make a prediction. But what the referendum would do if it were to pass is to increase the allowable amount of property tax by a fixed amount. But every year, the district, when the board authorizes the tax levy, that would give a new upper limit, but it would not have to tax that amount. It's merely raising the ceiling of what's possible a little bit.
So do you really think that you won't spend it and will it go down the following year? Honestly.
Yes.
That's not human nature.
No.
Yes.
I think looking at the budget numbers we've seen coming in for the coming year, no matter what the revenue situation is be, next couple of years will be under a lot of demand to a lot of expenses to pay.
And I just want to say quickly, I like Joe Zwickowski.
Yes.
But
people have lots of
facts
opinions
are
on the
facts.
That's still, yeah. So
This is business.
Right, I totally understood. Yeah. So the answer to the question is, it's an authorization to go up to that amount. It's not conceptually the district could levy 3.7 of the 4.2 conceptually.
Why
No.
not two?
Well, why not? So that could be possible, right?
That's also a really specific question.
Right.
That would be hard for one board member.
Right,
to
exactly.
answer.
That'd be kind of a board policy question.
But maybe take it back to the board for reconsideration.
They've already got it on the referendum.
And the reason I asked that, because I know River Falls, their referendum is not recurring. I believe theirs is like for 3 years, I think, from what I looked at. So, I at first when I looked at all this, I was like, okay, where are they getting the 4.2 million? And then I kind of saw that it was really just to kind of bring it up to where, inflation would get us to. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to go that high every year. And again, River Falls, I believe, is doing for 3 years. So, okay, what happens in year 4? Then you gotta come and do this all over again. So, I view it as, it's allowable. It's letting us get here if we need to. Maybe, a couple years you do, maybe a couple years you don't. And then I had a question on the teachers' salaries, like when there was a comparison up there in the BRC schools. Is that before the raise or with the raise?
Before.
This was the chart. I pulled this chart from that meeting.
Okay.
So this is what we were looking at when we decided to do that. And you can sort of see why, because it's definitely among the lower here. And it's like, well, if we don't do something, right? You know, and the question was, what should the amount be? What can we, what should the amount be that would keep our teachers in our buildings and not going to Eau Claire or Hudson or, Hudson in particular?
When you did that,
Yeah.
did you also compare the benefit packages?
So this, yes. I mean, yeah, so I don't remember all the details from a year ago, but we definitely went over the whole total pay plan pretty carefully at that time.
I just have one comment that I really want to make.
Sure, of course.
Okay, so I was a stay-at-home mom, actually technically still am since I don't have a job. But I have spent a lot of time in the schools. Brian can attest to that.
I can't do it.
Stuart can attest to that. I volunteered a lot, and I would say, we get this kind of idea that teachers, they're off in the summers, they're off on all these vacations, they have this easy job. And I would ask any one of you, I think the volunteering thing is great because you get in those schools, you're gonna see what those kids are like, they're gonna drive you crazy. I mean, teachers earn every penny, and when you see that they can go to Hudson and earn $10,000 more, why wouldn't you? Our teachers, his wife, I don't even wanna know how much time she spends above and beyond her teaching. I mean, she volunteers for everything, she's Science Olympiad coach, even I think when she wasn't coaching, she went down to help. I mean, that's my opinion, again, from my time in school. I can recall 2 teachers and all the teachers I've dealt with that I thought, you really shouldn't be here. All the rest of them, they are like heart and soul into that. They love those kids, and my kids have benefited so much from certain teachers that, teachers mean the world to these kids. And I don't get why we kind of put them down on this level, like,
I don't think we're talking about the teachers.
Okay, well, then if we want to talk about Zadowski, this would be my one comment there. So, I don't think anybody.
We're not talking about him
individually,
we're talking about all the other administrators and be quiet.
Well, if you talk about, like, your principals.
Who said that?
I did.
Okay, if you talk about your principals, I don't feel like they're overpaid. I think they're like 120. Principal's a big job. I don't think 120 is on the line. You have a master's degree, some of them are beyond. That's, I think, a fair pay. As far as Zadowski goes, though, who set his salary? Nobody on this board did.
That was a decade ago.
He's been here a long time, so I think your beef would be with the board maybe 10, 15 years ago, because that's already been set. Maybe he renegotiates, I don't know how it works, but I feel like that's not really anybody's fault in this room, like board people.
And to be fair, questions on Zadowski's, salary or anyone's salary for that matter, is it is a public policy question, right? Because it's not necessarily a personal question. It's a question about, what there are public servants in our community that our taxes pay for, right? Are we getting our money's worth out of those public servants, right? So I think it's a reasonable question to ask about, is this a reasonable pay? And we can, there's a whole bunch of details there. And even aside from, the person of Joe Zadowski and people's opinions of him in various ways, that's a whole different question than, is the salary reasonable for the work being done? So I think and the ballpark figure for principals was roughly correct. Yeah, I don't have the number, but it's in that range for sure. There's one other thing I thought I had to fill in, but maybe not. So, Margaret?
I want to clarify something. Abe, you said it would give us the authorization to spend 4.2 million. My understanding, unless things have changed though, is let's say you decided only to spend 2 million this year, that's your cap for all the following years. Well, I know Debbie Tollins put something through so you could recover about 75%, but I think that's been taken out. It's something you definitely need to check out. Brian, do you know the answer to that?
My understanding is the authorization.
So Chris would know the answer to this.
Yeah, but
So let me repeat the question. So there is the question of if a referendum is passed, an operating referendum is passed, and if there's a year when the full amount is not levied, does that decrease the available levy in the future?
I don't think so. I wrote a lot of that down because, you know, the questions that come up and the specificity of the answer. I would say I can go back to Eau Claire. Part of why we are where we are, sorry, I can talk loud. Part of the reason we are the way we are is because we didn't levy to the max when the revenue caps went in 93, 94.
That's it.
It was Uniroyal was closing. We did not levy to the max. Well, then that was the picture in time you keep talking about, which that's a great way to look at it. We have suffered since then, and we're going back to referendum again. So my question, I think you can. I think given.
You could not, between when I was on the board, that was one of the issues that we were trying to get through. And so I don't know if things are changed, but it's definitely something.
Most people
that
levy
should be
to the
changed.
max. They do.
Well, that's why I think we levy to the max, because if you don't, it's not going to be there in the future.
Well, and that's the thing, is, yes. And so, I was sitting there thinking about that, given your question, that's how broken the system is. I mean, I have a list of all the districts across the state and what they get per pupil. I mean, it is so broken. And now you pull your half a million now out for vouchers and charters?
700.
Well, now 700 because you upped it. So, and, yeah.
And there have been some references to this map, so I just want to bring it up quick. So this map is from 2 years ago. The map, as of today, is not quite this bad because of the last budget. But this is the revenue limit per student of all the districts across the state. Let me actually look at this full screen of it. So this is from 2022. So these numbers have changed a bit, and it's not as it's less unfair than it was 2 years ago because of a few changes in the state budget. But you can see there's a wide variation of how many of which districts get how much per student, and so you'll have adjacent districts where District 1 at 2 years ago got less than $10,000 per student from the state in terms of their total revenue limit. I apologize, and a neighboring district might have well over $12,000. Now this map was basically established in 1994, I believe, or 1993, where the state budget, the state imposed this revenue limit system, and they didn't want to kind of give districts the heads up about what was going to happen, so they froze the numbers based on the previous year's budget. So some districts the prior year had just done a new building or had just done something else which raised their revenue per student, and they said, the legislature said, okay, last year you needed this much per student, we're going to freeze that in for all the future years. So those numbers have been basically frozen since 1994. Now, again, the number hasn't been frozen, but the starting position was as they went forward in time. But to give some context for fairness to the legislature, I've been pretty hard on them today. Here's a number. These numbers. This graph was just released. There it is. Just released like a month ago, based on the new budget. And so what happened was, notice it starts at 11,325. So there's still a big jump because some districts have $14,000, $16,000 per student. But what the legislature did do, to their credit, is they took those lower two categories, the red and orange in the previous one, and bumped them up. So the worst case scenario isn't as bad. And so it's not as unfair as it was from 1994 until 2 years ago, but it's still not, you still wouldn't exactly call this fair. It's just less unfair. All right, so I just want to get that context because we're talking about the snapshot, the picture of the districts.
Hi, my name is Lisa Pellner, and I am a business owner in Menomonie. I have 4 grandchildren in the school district, going from the grade school all the way up to the high school. I'm also an active volunteer in the community. So I just wanted to follow up on some comments that I've heard. First of all, yes, we need a volunteer coordinator. I have also had a hard time finding places to volunteer in the school district. I used to do it a lot. All winter long, I'd do 2-3 days a week. Now it's hard to do. The teachers need our support. As a business owner, I did keep up with wages as best to my ability without outpacing the pricing we can do for our products and services. whenever we have extra money, I have kept up with trying to give bonuses to my employees because your employees are the core. And as far as teachers go, our teachers go into a school. If you don't think they should be paid what they're paid, you're wrong. Go into a classroom, hang out with them, they work their tails off, and I think they should get more. Unfortunately, we can't do that because we probably can't afford it, but I don't think anybody should talk down about what our teachers make because you have no idea how hard they work.
I'm Dan Paulson. I was on the school board for 3 years, and during my first year, the district administrator obtained his doctorate degree, and the school board decided that he should be rewarded with a 3% annuity. And my question at that time was, well, okay, 3% of what, and how does 3% is going, any kind of a percentage is going to increase. And so, and that's the problem we're in now with our, I'm sorry, our top level administrators. When you give them percentage increases, it widens the disparity. I don't think a district administrator should be paid more than 1.7 times the highest paid teacher. But when you start giving them, okay, so cost of living increase, we're going to give everybody 4%. No, don't give the administration 4%. Give the administration a commensurate increase. But if you give them percentage increases, they're just going to get, there's going to be greater disparity. Now we're at, $210,000 for a base salary, and plus all kinds of, other benefits, and so that's a problem. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I look at the things that are happening in our elementary schools and our middle school, and I am incredibly impressed with the work that they've been doing. Our kids are beginning to do well. The high school has a ways to go, and I think they need to work on that. So the money that we're giving them is giving us benefits. Our kids are learning; they're improving. We're slowly closing the gaps between those underachieving kids, and that's important. And we need to continue to do that, emphasize that. We got to remember that this is all about the kids. Now I know it's hard for some people to face an increase in taxes, and we need to there needs to be a system that can deal with that. But that's unfortunately that's beyond the scope of our what we can do. But I think it's important that we continue doing the things that we're doing. Don't get extravagant. I don't want to see sometime thinking, oh, we got all kinds of money now maybe we can have the football team playing football on the new sports complex. No, that kind of stuff is going to. I think we should fire the superintendent if he suggests that, even thinks of it.
Thanks for those comments, Dan. Yeah, I think it's worth noting, there's a lot of experience, both Margaret and Dan, of previous board members who have lots of background there. So I think we've gone over time by quite lots of fascinating conversation.
I think the library closes it too.
I know. I'm fairly exhausted, so I think we should probably clear out and let the library do its stuff. But thank you all for being here. Fascinating discussions. I took lots of notes. Very cool. Thank you, Dan.